For 70 years, the United States operated as the underwriter of global security, maintaining the rules of international trade. Today, Washington is stepping back from that role and has instead started collecting protection money. This is predatory hegemony. It occurs when a dominant power stops using its position to build stable relationships and starts using its leverage to extract transactional concessions from both its rivals and its allies. For 2 centuries, American power moved in a single direction, outward, from a fractured coastline in 1776 through aggressive continental expansion to becoming the architect of the post-Cold War order. But between 1991 and today, that trajectory changed. The nation that emerged from the 20th century with total global dominance began to isolate itself while still sitting at the absolute center of the world. When a nation shifts from building an order to breaking it for immediate gain, the impact eventually reaches the financial and border security of the world we live in today. When the Soviet Union collapsed in late 1991, the bipolar era ended. This left the United States with a level of global supremacy that was entirely unchecked. This birthed the unipolar moment, characterized by the unquestioned assumption that the American model was the only remaining path for the rest of the world to follow. That certainty led to imperial overstretch. Trillions of dollars were channeled into decades of conflict in the Middle East, draining American resources and burning through the global goodwill that had followed the Cold War victory. While military spending remained high, the domestic industrial base was decaying. Manufacturing hubs were hollowed out by trade shifts, leaving behind a landscape of empty factories and economic stagnation. When the public sees $3 trillion spent on foreign interventions while their own towns deindustrialize, the cost of global leadership begins to look like a liability. This domestic friction turned the long-standing consensus on foreign policy into a target for a radical populist reversal. The America First doctrine emerged as a direct response to this decline. Instead of using diplomacy to manage a changing world, Washington began using its existing leverage to force better terms for itself. This strategy involved imposing heavy tariffs on traditional allies and demanding that they pay a fee to remain under the protection of the American defense umbrella. At the same time, the administration dismantled American soft power. It cut more than 5,300 foreign aid awards, withdrew from the World Health Organization, and reduced funding for global scientific research, the very things that once made U.S. leadership appear beneficial. By weaponizing the dollar and global banking access to enforce its will, Washington forced other nations to seek alternative safety valves. These aid cuts and financial sanctions created the strategic necessity for rivals to build parallel trade and payment networks that don't require American permission. The most direct result of this pressure is the CRINC axis: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This group has become an unprecedented coalition of states, united by the fact that they are all heavily sanctioned. This is not an alliance based on shared values or trust. It is a survival syndicate where members share energy, soldiers, and shells to circumvent American economic blockades. China acts as the decisive enabler of this group. Beijing uses its industrial might and opaque financial system to provide a lifeline to the other 3 nations, facilitating the trade of resources and dual-use equipment that would otherwise be blocked. By aggressively using economic tools to isolate its enemies, Washington accidentally forced its greatest rivals to build a single, cohesive supply chain that is now independent of the West. The decoupling of the global system traces back to 1974, when the U.S. and Saudi Arabia struck a deal. Washington would provide military security, and Riyadh would price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. This petrodollar system was a pillar of American power. As nations bought oil, they needed dollars, which the Saudis then invested back into U.S. Treasury bonds. This created a steady source of demand that allowed Washington to finance widening national deficits. But the logic of that trade has broken. The U.S. shale revolution made America a top producer and less reliant on imports, while China has become Saudi Arabia's largest customer, buying 20% of their oil. In June 2024, the informal petrodollar deal expired. Saudi Arabia is now exploring projects like mBridge, which uses central bank digital currencies to settle trades in yuan and other currencies, creating pathways that exist entirely outside of U.S. influence. The end of the exclusive petrodollar removes the structural safety net that has underwritten American global dominance for half a century. It signals a future where the dollar remains prominent, but without its previous level of control. The global landscape has fractured into a multi-order world. Instead of a single system shared by everyone, we are seeing the rise of decoupled frameworks and parallel rules. While the U.S. pivots towards protectionism and extraction from its allies, China and its partners are building new infrastructure and financial networks to reshape the world to favor autocratic interests. Ernest Hemingway once noted that bankruptcy happens gradually and then suddenly. The same is true for the collapse of global influence when a hegemon prioritizes short-term gains over its long-term network of power. As the U.S. reaches its 250th anniversary, the greatest systemic threat is self-inflicted isolation. Tell us in the comments which historical domino you want covered next.